office while the economy was cratering in real time, if you will. But, like FDR, also inherited a financial rescue plan from his predecessor, one implemented by Bush Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson, Fed Chairman Bernanke, and the head of the New York Fed, Tim Geithner, a Larry Summers protege, and of course now Obama's Treasury Secretary. Obama then signed a massive economic stimulus package into law, $787 billion, or about 5.5% of 2008 GDP. And to give you a sense of the scale of the stimulus, I'll do a historical sense of this in a second, but $787 billion is about 1.3 times the cost of the Iraq War as of February 2009, and slightly larger in relative terms than the cost of the 1947 Marshall Plan. And with this stimulus package in place, Obama, as we know, moved on to health care reform, bracketing for the moment any broader regulatory reforms to be made to the nation's banking and financial system. But beyond these broad outlines, between the 1930s and today, though, as Barack Obama enters into the second year of his presidency, it now seems as good a moment as any to take a step back and recall what exactly the New Deal did. How exactly does this past rhyme with our present, and what further opportunities and dangers can it illuminate for Obama? Roosevelt's New Deal marked an unprecedented use of federal authority in response to the Great Depression. In 1933, nearly a quarter of the American workforce was out of a job. But while today, we often think of the New Deal's remaining legacies as Social Security, federal bank deposit insurance, or the Securities and Exchange Commission, this partial list ignores what the New Deal was really all about during the 1930s. During the Great Depression, the central enterprise of the New Deal was its public works programs. Through Harold Ickes' Public Works Administration and Harry Hopkins' WPA, the federal government spent huge sums of money in all but 3 of the nation's 3,071 counties. The WPA's 1935 appropriation of $4.8 billion was by itself the equivalent of 135% of federal revenues, about 6.7% of the nation's GDP in that year, roughly comparable to this economic stimulus that Obama has just passed. 2/3 of all New Deal funds between 1933 and 39 went to public works construction and economic stimulus. So these public works agencies put people to work across the country, constructing such projects as roads, sewers, hydroelectric dams, and hundreds of airports. Believing in socially useful infrastructure, these New Dealers built in order to improve the nation and to invest in the future. For example, the New Deal built new schools in 47%, nearly half, of the nation's counties, schools that are in many cases still in use today. These public works programs leverage the abilities of an uncommonly smart set of public servants. Hopkins, Ickes, and their subordinates were skilled public administrators, somewhat of a marked change from, say, the last 8 years. They were blessed with the talent for tapping the legal and engineering expertise they needed when facing a national emergency. And it's worth noting, these New Dealers were not afraid of using market capitalism when it suited them. Ickes' Public Works Administration, for example, built its projects by accepting bids from private contractors such as Bechtel and Brown and Root, today a subsidiary of Halliburton. This government-sponsored economic development was impressive in both scale and scope. It did not represent the expansion of federal power at the expense of state and local authority. Right? The New Deal was not, Newt Gingrich's tentacles of the federal government reaching into the counties and states and telling them what to do. This was not the story of the New Deal. The New Deal approved and funded projects that were proposed by state and local governments themselves. State and local governments provided matching funds in order to receive federal grants and loans, placing their own tax dollars in support of FDR's programs. Of course, the New Deal had many shortcomings. Given the vast nature of the Great Depression, public works programs were not able on their own to eliminate mass unemployment. As we all know, this job was left to mobilization of the nation's economy during World War II. Minorities and women were, as a generation of historians has carefully documented, left behind relative to white men. However, the New Deal scored an important and often forgotten victory during this dark time, deploying federal power in transforming the infrastructure of a country the size of a continent and putting millions of Americans back to work. So, if public works construction, as I've just argued, was the core of the New Deal, how might this history help us think about the present? I would propose 3 tentative propositions. First, it's worth noting how hard Roosevelt's New Dealers worked to strike the right balance between public authority and private market capitalism. At the same time, they were not afraid to deploy their resources and spend, relative to the size of the government, relative to the size of the economy, on a huge scale. Second, the successes of the New Deal depended to a large degree on its ability to elicit the tangible support of state and local governments. Like their predecessors then, the members of Obama's administration will need to arrive at an effective mix between public and private action, and they would be well served to recall the revolutionary scale of New Deal funding as they contemplate their investments. Third, as I hinted at in my introduction, there's a political lesson in this history, one that we can find if we follow Harry Hopkins to the racetrack where he liked to relax in 1938. Going to the racetrack for Hopkins actually meant going to the racetrack. It was not a synonym for hiking the Appalachian Trail. So Hopkins liked to go to the racetrack. And he was asked by a reporter while wagering on horses, what was the key to the New Deal's success? How would you define this? And Hopkins put it in an informal response that of course, he immediately denied, saying that the key to the New Deal was that it was a political project that could tax and tax, spend and spend, and elect and elect. And this has become this sort of right-wing critique of modern liberalism. It's tax and spend liberalism. But at the time, in the 1930s, when Hopkins made this statement, it really was pure genius. He succinctly identified the qualities that made New Deal liberalism both so powerful and, we often forget, so controversial. The taxing and spending